Hello everyone, today we will be presenting about Mexican immigration to the United States. Topics that we'll be covering today: characterization of immigrant, what was the situation in the old country, when was the largest influx of immigrants and where did they go, how did they assimilate, problems they have faced, laws that were targeting them, famous people of this ethnicity, what contribution to American culture had this group made, the stereotype this group has faced or continues to face, Mexican in popular media. Immediately following the US-Mexican War conclusion, Mexican immigration started. The United States forcibly invaded Mexico and occupied its sovereign territory for nearly 2 years, motivated by the annexationist plans to further Western lands and resources. The US-Mexican War was widely supported by a populace that believed its gain would add to America's prosperity and fortune. According to the rhetoric of the time, it was the manifest destiny of the United States to become a continent-spanning nation, spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, connecting it to Europe and the Caribbean on the east and south, as well as the Asian markets from the Pacific West. Mexico and the United States were at war from April 25, 1846 through February 2, 1848. By occupying Mexican land, and the Republic of Texas had falsely claimed following its independence in 1836, the United States sparked conflicts. The American government pressed this claim when Texas became a state in 1845, deploying troops into the disputed area and starting a war. Nearly half of Mexico's national territory, or what is now the states of New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado, was captured by the winning Americans at the end of the war. Mexico received $18 million in exchange for this enormous area. Mexicans still claim that American Texans were the first illegal immigrants to enter Mexico and start the US-Mexico War. When they hear Americans' complaints about illegal Mexican immigrants attacking American territory, Mexican citizens remaining in the conquered region had a year to return to Mexico. Under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which put an end to the war on February 2, 1848, those who stayed around automatically became citizens of the United States, with government guarantees as outlined in the treaty, ensuring the protection of their rights, property, and quote-unquote white racial status, guarantees that there were infrequently upheld in practice. The number of Mexicans who remain in their current locations and those who return to the country's newly defined national areas is unknown. 31,000 people on average are believed to have returned to Mexico. Demographers estimate that 86,000 people of Mexican ancestry live in the United States at the time based on 1850 census. With nearly 60,000 people of Mexican descent, New Mexico, the oldest and the most significant territory of far northern Mexico, has the highest population density. When gold was found at John's Shutter Mill in Northern California on January 24, just 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, ending the Mexican War, the first significant wave of Mexican immigration northward began in 1848. California's placer fields and mines were immediately occupied by Mexican men with vast mining experience, adding 6,500 people to the territory's ethnic Mexican population. The population of ethnic Mexican in California increased by more than 2,000 in just 2 years, to almost 14,000 according to the 1850 statistic. Other than the fact that they were primarily experienced laborers who had spent years in Mexico's silver mining and processing areas of work, almost little is known about the amount of these Mexican immigrants who arrived between 1848 and the 1870s, or their labor histories. They came from the same peasant background as the Mexican mine workers. High unemployment rates among a growing number of the landless rural peasantry in Mexico drove them out of the country, while greater pay drew them to the US. Throughout 1810, when Mexico began its struggle for independence from Spain, and 1876, Porfirio Diaz was elected president the nation endured a series of brutal civil wars that challenged its system of government. After President Diaz was elected in 1876, Mexico officially entered an era of comparatively good economics and political stability known as the Pax Porfiriana because the president's authority helped to curb bloodshed and transform Mexico into a modern, successful country. Diaz's ambitious plan focused on luring foreign capital into the railroad, mining, oil, and manufacturing sectors. It was financed by significant loans, land concessions, and the renunciation of subsoil mineral rights. In order to further unify the nation's region and connect them to its Pacific and Gulf ports, railroads were built. This made it much simpler to export the country's goods to Europe and the US. Peasants who had been rootless built the majority of Mexico's railroads. These guys moved to urban areas in search of wage jobs. In a step-like manner, after leaving their ancestral villages, after this they traveled northward via the railroad networks through Mexico before effortlessly crossing into America, where there was no shortage of employment available at competitive pay. In Mexico, in 1900, a railroad tie installer made, on average, 20 cents per day. The identical work earned $1 in the US. Peasants who found work on massive haciendas, which is export farms and ranches, in Mexico were paid 20 cents per day, typically in supplies, but in the US they could make up to $1.5 per day. Mexican immigrants, laborers, most of whom were men, were situated in several economic areas throughout the year 1876 to 1930. They initially migrated to California to work in the state gold mines before moving to other extractive industries, primarily copper and coal sectors. The establishment of irrigation system that turned the parched desert of West into lush farmland was followed by the building of railroads that started to traverse the American West. Sometimes women traveled alongside their male relative, working as housemaid and nannies in homes or laundry facilities, hotels, and restaurants. But their number was never proportionally substantial until the 1960s. Largest influx of immigrants and where did they go? In the years following, the number of Mexican immigrants in the United States increased significantly. Around 42,000 ethnic Mexicans were identified by US statistics as living in the country by the year 1870. Estimated around 68,000 immigrants in the year 1880. Estimated around 78,000 immigrants in the year 1890. Estimated around 103,000 immigrants in the year 1900. Estimated around 222,000 in the year 1910. In the year 1920, estimated around 486,000 immigrants, and a decade later in 1930, estimated around 641,000 immigrants by the year 1930. Texas was home to 41% of these immigrants, who largely worked there harvesting cotton and carrying cattle. California came in second in terms of regional importance, with 31% of Mexican immigrants working in agriculture there. Arizona implemented 8% of labor force, New Mexico 3%, Colorado 2%, and the majority of these workers worked primarily in the production of sugar beets. This large-scale immigration into the United States was made possible during a time of high labor demand in the United States, thanks to the people and economic displacement caused by Mexican modernization between 1876 and 1910. Huge proportion of the ancestral lands have been lost to Mexican peasants, following a period of rapid inflation in the price of essential goods, which resulted in severe income disparities and middle-class complaints against the government. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 was sparked. Up to 1.4 million soldiers and civilians were massacred during this civil war as several factions fought for control of the governmental apparatus. Those who were mobile fled to safety, and the carnage in America. Approximately 661,000 Mexicans were officially admitted to the United States as immigrants between 1910 and 1929, according to the annual reports of Commissioner General of Immigration, a figure that substantially underestimates the true size of this influx. Between 1910 and 1914, when the Mexican Revolution was at its bloodiest, barely 16,000 Mexican immigrants per year on average requested access to all of these ports. It was evident that the majority of Mexican immigrants were arriving in the United States by train, mules, or foot rather than by ship. The numbers of Mexican immigrants increased at around 88,000 in 1924 alone after inspection posts were finally built along the land border between Mexico and the United States. Between 1900 and 1929, Mexican immigrants were required since the labor of other easily controlled immigrants had been severely constrained or forbidden. The Federal Bureau of Immigration was formed in 1864, marking the beginning of federal regulation of immigration in the US. States used to be able to admit anybody they desired. The appointment of Superintendent of Immigration based on the Treasury Department occurred in the year 1891, and the establishment of Ellis Island as an immigration inspection facility followed in the year 1894. The Immigration Act of 1907 placed the first substantial limitations on immigration, which excluded imbeciles, people with feeble-minded, those who have physical or mental health difficulties that may make it difficult for them to work, those who have tuberculosis, children traveling without their parents, those who have admitted to committing crimes, misdemeanor, and women coming to the country for immoral reasons are prohibited. It seems that every immigrant had to pay a $4 head tax and pass a variety of physical exams verifying their fitness, energy, and capacity for hard labor in order to ensure that they would not become public burdens dependent on poor relief. These quality admission restrictions were combined with the first quantitative caps on the total number of immigrants who might enter the country each year under a more comprehensive Immigration Act of 1917. All adults over the age of 16 were required to take literacy tests, which were largely intended to exclude Eastern Europeans, Jews, and Catholics from Southern Europe. A $10 visa charge was added, and the head tax was raised to $8. The Johnson-Reed Act, which established national quotas based on the percentage of foreign-born from a particular country as listed in the 1890 census, was passed in 1924. Capping this period of tightening immigration restrictions, a maximum of 165,000 immigrants were allowed in each year. The goal of this law was to attract the best immigrants, to ensure that those who admitted would fully assimilate and quickly, and ensure that the future of immigrants to the nation would be white and Protestant, primarily from Northern and Western Europe, rather than Catholics and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe. The United States Border Patrol was established by the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 and placed under the Department of Labor Purview. It was given broad authority to enforce immigration, entry, and departure laws, primarily along the southern border. The Johnson-Reed Act did not appease American navalists, despite their loud protests over the increasingly obvious presence of huge numbers of Mexican immigrants and their congressional supporters, in large part due to political clout of economic interest in America West. Workers from Mexico and Canada, which are countries in the Western Hemisphere, were given a significant quota exception under the Act. While there was little net migration between Canada and the US, the exception appeased the agricultural, mining, and the manufacturing industries, which by 1924 had almost entirely relied on Mexican labor because they were inexpensive, flexible, subservient, and willing to put up with appalling work conditions without complaining. Nearly 700,000 legally admitted Mexican immigrants entered the country between the year 1900 and 1930. The majority, 87%, work mostly as seasonal migrants, agricultural wage laborers in rural southwest areas. Around 18% of most of the women involved worked outside the home. The majority of them, which is 44%, were engaged in Anglo houses, performing domestic and personal service, or laboring in the fields, which is 14%. Oftentimes, alongside their male relatives, some of the males brought their wives. The second stage of Mexican immigration history was characterized by reverse migration, which is conducted through a significant repatriation campaign. It began on Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, when the American stock market collapsed, precipitating a significant global economic depression. Social workers who had played a key role in resuscitating and combating the Mexican problem intensified their effort and took them to Congress, saying the Mexican immigrants were unmotivated, overly dependent, ill, criminal, illiterate, and saying that Mexican immigrants were unmotivated, overly dependent, ill, criminal, illiterate, and unassimilable. Shortly after the year 1929, success finally emerged. Together with immigration authorities, social workers identified Mexicans who had only requested food basket and clothing, labeled them as public charges, and sought their swift removal. Dragnets were used in the Southwest between 1930 and 1934. In public squares, parks, and even workplaces, dragnets were used to indiscriminately round up Mexican immigrants, including those with permanent visas and citizens of Mexico. They were then put on trains and carried south to the border, sometimes all the way into Mexico. They forced deportation and presumably voluntary repatriation and had a clear purpose: to eliminate public of ethnic Mexican contenders for low-skilled, low-paying employment that white Americans claimed they would gladly do, and that was legitimately theirs. Mass deportation became possible in the Southwest since very few Mexicans had given citizenship. The majority were politically disadvantaged, and the majority had worked in racially segregated communities that limited their social integration into local communities. And the larger body politic, social workers steadfastly resisted carrying out such draconian actions against Northern and Western European immigrants living in the Midwest and Northeast. The Apology Act for the 1930s Mexican repatriation program was passed by the state of California in 2005, around 75 years after the start of these operations of mass deportation. The act indicated that almost 2 million ethnic Mexicans, including 1.2 million American citizens of Mexican heritage, were deported, with about 400,000 of them coming from California alone in the early 1930s. The state of California expresses regret to those people for the grave abuses of their fundamental civil freedoms and constitutional rights that occurred during the period of forcible immigration and illegal expulsion. The state of California regrets the pain and suffering those people and their families went through as direct result of the 1930s repatriation program, which was founded by the government. The decline in Mexican immigration to the United States spanned roughly in the years 1930 to 1942. The traditional employers of Mexican labor frequently requested the federal government to reduce their severe labor demands as the country accelerated and the United States prepared to enter World War II. While young men quickly grew the military's rank, their claims were consistently rejected by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, which gave the justification that there was already a supply of American workers willing to complete the request work for competitive salaries. Moving on to guest workers, wetbacks, and the birth of deportation regime. The Mexican Ministry of Foreign Relations was informed of the request by the State Department, and they subsequently hired the required number of people. After Braceros arrived in the country, American middlemen took them to their designated location for specific periods of time. Braceros were promised set wages on par with those received by American agricultural workers, as well as fair living and working conditions, transportation to and from the border, and a 10% withholding from their pay that would be saved in a Mexican bank account and paid out if and when they returned to Mexico. Texas was first prohibited from taking part in the program because Mexicans there had previously received terrible treatment, but once the 1948 agreement was extended, Braceros were finally recruited to labor there as well. Congress gave its approval for this immediate labor mobilization, formerly known as Public Law 45, between 1942 and 1945. It was renewed every year until 1951, at which point Public Law 78, which didn't last through 1964, renewed it. 219,000 Mexican braceros participate in the program between 1942 and 1947, working in 24 states. The majority worked in agriculture in California, tending cotton, citrus fruits, melons, lettuce, and several other table veggies. Railroad businesses employed around a third of all braceros. Many braceros complained about their oppressive living and working conditions, their inability to form unions, Mexico's onerous labor recruitment procedures, and their inability to actually receive 10% the referred wages promised when they return home, despite contractual guarantees to the country. By 1948, the United States had come to realize that the scarcity of braceros contract and the enormous need for cheap labor during World War II had preceded a sizable population of Mexican immigrants who could easily find work without being subjected to border checks or requiring work authorization documents. Since some of these laborers had literally swarmed across the Rio Grande without being checked into the country, they were mockingly referred as wetbacks. Only twice as many, 219,000 Mexicans without proper documentation, were detained by the NIS between 1942 and 1947. The number of Mexicans reaches 428,000. These figures give a sense of the ratio of authorized to undocumented immigrants throughout these years, even though some of these unauthorized entrants were repeat offenders. In 1964, the Braceros program was finished. The United States issued over 4.6 million visas for guest workers between 1942 and 1964. The average numbers of visas issued per year was roughly 200,000. The actual number of people taking part in this program was probably closer to 3 million because many of these braceros were seasonal sojourners who returned each year, frequently to the same employer. The NIS deported and detained 5.5 million undocumented Mexican workers during these same years, or nearly 500,000 each year, with the year 1954 marking the peak. Then, in a widely publicized NIS repatriation campaign known as Operation Wetback, 1.2 million Mexican illegal aliens were apprehended and deported to appease a mobilized anti-immigrant citizenry, especially in Texas and California, where employers for a long time had simply disregarded immigration laws and hired the labor they needed whenever and however they wanted. This was prompted by growing security concerns about the potential communist inflation of the United States. By 1955, just 242,608 Mexicans has been detained and deported by the NIS. Moving on, immigration, liberalization, and the illegal alien. John F. Kennedy ran for president of the United States in the year 1960 on a platform that highlighted the contribution made to the nation by immigrants. Even the notion of immigrants, a book that demonstrated their historical significance, was ghostwritten by him. Kennedy ran on a platform of immigration reform, but after being assassinated less than 3 years into his team, it fell to his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to target the bill passed by Congress on October 3, 1965. Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act into law, resulting in the fourth stage of Mexican immigration history. The Hart-Celler Act, also known as the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, was praised for eliminating many of the old, outdated prejudice that had been firmly embedded in American immigration law since 1924, which had explicitly sought to create a majority white population in Northern and Western European ancestry. The 1965 signing was held against the backdrop of the Statue of Liberty, and President Johnson noted that it would fix a colossal and agonizing fault in the foundation of American justice. It righteously corrects the terrible and ongoing evil in the behavior of American nation. People desiring to immigrate to America will be allowed based on their qualifications and the degree which they are related to those currently living here. The Asiatic Barred Zone. Immigration restrictions were lifted. Instead of national origin quotas, there are now numeral caps for each nation. The number of immigration who are permitted to enter United States each year increased from 165 to 290,000, with 170,000 of those immigrants coming from the Eastern Hemisphere, which is Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific. Each country was given the opportunity to issue up to 20,000 immigrants visas based on a set conditional preferences. Only 120,000 immigrants per year were permitted into the Western Hemisphere. Mexico, which in 1964 provided the United States with about 800 immigrant laborers annually, felt its impact right away. Mexico now had to compete for the 120,000 visa slots that supported family reunification with Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean immediately. There's no longer a legal method for approximately 600,000 undocumented Mexican employees to change their status or be dried out. These workers had continued to enter the country illegally and had little trouble finding employment once they got there. They were demonized more and more as lawbreakers and illegal foreigners, while their American bosses escaped with no repercussions. As a result, Mexicans once more rose to status of undesirable, submissive, deportable workers in America. Although the Hart-Celler Act was praised for its easing of immigration rules, it really had the opposite impact on Mexico, sharply reducing the number of visas, authorization, and categorically declaring the steady flow of workers north as illegal. Leo Chavez, an anthropologist, described this procedure as a game of cat and mouse. The number of deported aliens increased from 151,000 to 781,000 between 1968 and 1976. 99% of them, according to the NIS, were Mexicans. Mexicans detained without inspection or permits frequently agreed to forego their rights to a hearing before an immigration judge in order to speed their deportation to Mexico, only to repeat the process after realizing that, on average, only 1 out of every 3 undocumented immigrants was captured. Concern grew over the undocumented Mexican immigrants who were becoming more visible. The Hart-Celler Act was revised by Congress in 1976, limiting Mexico to 20,000 immigrant visas annually, allowing only family reunions of spouses, unmarried minor children, and parents of adult U.S. residents. The Refuge Act of 1980 reduced Mexico visas allotment to 18,200. The rate of unlawful immigration only increased as a result of the rigorous restriction placed on Mexican immigrant visas. According to sociologists Douglas Masley and Andre Singer, there were 23.4 million escaped from Mexico and 28 million undocumented arrival between 1965 and 1986. They calculate a net increase of 5.7 million immigrants from Mexico, 4.6 million, or the bulk, were not permitted. Moving on, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, or the IRCA. By the 1980s, there was an increasing number of undocumented Mexican immigrants living in the major cities who were being demonized by conservative politicians and the media's threats, which caused anxiety among many citizens. The US-Mexico border was being described as out of control by many. Finally, in 1986, President Ronald Reagan approved and signed the legislation written by Senator Alan Simpson, or R. Wyoming, and Representative Peter Rodino, Dean, New Jersey. The sixth significant turning point in history of Mexican immigration occurred on January 1st, 1987, when the Immigration Reform and Control Act (IRCA) went into force. In order to pass the bill, a variety of factions had to be appeased, including organized labor, immigrant rights activists, and Mexican-American civil rights organizations. This took the form of granting nearly 3 million undocumented immigrants amnesty and access to legalization. About 2.3 million people, or the majority, were Mexican. Those who entered the country illegally before January 1st, 1982, had to demonstrate that they had lived there continuously, were law-abiding citizen-free convictions, could speak English, had basic understanding of American history, and were willing to admit that they had entered the country without authorization or inspection in exchange for a fine and any back taxes they might owe. The primary effect of IRCA on Mexican immigration was to transform a protracted circular migratory movement into permanent residency north of the border. The US government sought allocating 90% of the funds for INS border to interdict and only 10% employment verification and employer sanctions. Unauthorized immigrants face increased risk and expense of being apprehended trying to cross the border. But if they were successful, they had a strong possibility of avoiding deportation and going unnoticed for a long time. Due to this reality, seasonal circular migration became significantly discouraged, leading to an increase the number of undocumented Mexican immigrants who were forced to remain in the country and lead lonely, fearful lives. The Anti-Terrorism and Effect Death Penalty Act, or AEDPA. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IIRIRA, and the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, PRWORA, which were primarily hailed as welfare reform but included immigrant provisions, were three new harsh immigration laws passed in 1996. IIRIRA gave the Border Patrol the right to accept, imprison, and deport anyone who crossed the country borders without first seeking a judge approval. This power also applied to people who had filed for asylum or were refugees. IIRIRA changed a number of minor non-violence offenses that were once considered simple misdemeanors into severe felonies that immediately led to obligatory deportation. As a result, immigration were progressively denied access to any type of judicial review before leaving the country. Federal colleague loans and social security benefits were off limits to undocumented immigrants. The AEDPA anti-terrorism bill, which gave local police forces the power to execute immigrants' rules, substantially curtailed the constitutional rights and judicial resources normally accorded to lawful resident foreigners. Last but not least, despite not being specifically directed at immigrants, PRWORA drastically reduced the benefits that permitted immigrants may obtain from federal and state authorities. The number of deportation and immigration detention increased immediately as a result of these three legislation. The war on terror followed afterwards, following the September 11, 2001 attacks on the United States. More immigration legislation was passed. American president, the media, and the concerned people increasingly used the securitization narrative, which dominated much the law 1996 legislation. The first was the USA Patriot Act, which President George W. Bush signed into law on October 26, 2001. Its full name is Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. Foreign immigrants were caught in its web, even though its strictest provisions were intended to stop the financing international terrorism. As a result, the government was given the power to monitor all private communications coming from abroad. It also created the legal framework for deporting suspected terrorists who were already in the country, even if they had valid visa authorization. Following were laws with a renewed emphasis on the security. The Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002, which President Bush signed on May 14, mandated that the NIS share all of its foreign database information with the State Department and create a single computer search engine that is accessible at all inspection stations, add computer-readable and tamper-resistant biometric identifiers to American visas, entry and travel documents, and provide funding for hiring of 1,600 new INS agents. The Department of Homeland Security (DHS), which united 22 different federal departments and agencies on November 25, 2002, was established later that year with the global creation strengthen Homeland Security enterprise and more secure America that is better equipped to confront that range of threat as we face. Following this, the Real ID Act of 2005 established federal information standards for all state identification cards and driver license needed to board aircraft, visit federal buildings, and access nuclear power facilities. It tightened regulation regarding asylum and the deportation of terrorists, altered visa restriction for temporary workers, established delivery bonds, which is similar to bail bonds for aliens released while waiting immigration hearing, and paid for the construction of border wall along 14-mile stretch across San Diego County, California. The newly established Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE), formerly known as the INS, supported the new laws with a number of well-publicized DHS enforcement and removal campaigns. By 2012, Operation Endgame aimed to apprehend and deport all removable aliens and suspected terrorists in the country. In Operation Frontline, illegal aliens who were posed as a threat to national security were deported. Following Operation Zone Garden in 2004, the Security Borderlands Initiative in 2005, and arguably most known to the American public in 2010. If you see something, say something campaign, zero enforcement and removal initiative were launched. 8.3 million immigration made quote-unquote voluntary returns between fiscal years 2001 and 2008. While George W. Bush was president, this figure was marked by opponents of immigration as catch and release scheme. Unauthorized Mexican immigrants detained during such raids were taken to the border without taking their fingerprints taken, receiving a legal penalty, or having their entrance or exit records annotated. In the same years, there were 2 million formal deportations known as the alien removal, which were reviewed by a judge or an ICE agent and produced a record of the circumstances behind the departure. A strong criticism President Bush received for what some saw as his adequate border enforcement practices led to an increase in aliens removal over 90% by conclusion of his administration, from 139,000 in 2001 to 360,000 in 2008. Between the fiscal years 2009 and 2016, Barack Obama was president, there was a noticeable increase in the ratio of voluntary returns to deportation of aliens. DHS noted 5.2 million immigrant exits, including 2.1 million voluntary returns and 3 million removals. His top aim was to show that the US-Mexico border was safe and largely impregnable in order to persuade Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. His quote-unquote zero-tolerance approach for undocumented border crosser mostly depended on formal deportation process and removals. But same as aforementioned, figures demonstrate many unlawful immigrants were urged to leave willingly or face lengthy and expensive formal deportation procedures. According to the data, President Bush deported 10.3 million immigrants between 2001 and 2008, with 3 out of every 4 being voluntary returns. Half of many, or 5.2 million, were deported under President Obama between 2009 2016. The majority, or 2 of every 3, were removals of aliens, with priority given to those with criminal records and repeated immigration offenses.
Moving on to the stereotypes that Mexican immigrants face and continue to face. The prevalence of stereotypical representation of Mexican Americans is fueled by anti-immigration attitude. Mexican Americans are frequently viewed and portrayed as recently alive cultural parasites, despite the fact that the majority of them are at least partially derived from indigenous people and have lived in the United States for many generations. Mexicans are unfairly and degradingly portrayed in stereotypes, particularly those who are allegedly living illegally in the United States. First, Hispanic and crime. According to a number of academics, prejudices about Hispanic are comparable to those about African American. Hispanic are frequently stereotyped in the United States in regard to crime, particularly by their white counterpart as being dangerous, drug trafficker, drug user, violent, and gangbanger. Contrary to popular opinion, however, crime rate among Hispanic immigrants are lower than those of the general population. Moreover, Hispanic men are portrayed as hard labor workers or uneducated and lazy. Male Hispanic are often categorized as either manual laborers or lazy citizens, two opposing popular stereotypes regarding employment. Many Hispanic Americans are viewed as hard laborers such as farmhand, gardener, and cleaner, while having comparable education and skill level. This stereotype is similar to that of the immigrant in that it holds that all Hispanic engage in manual labor and hard labor solely because they are entered the nation lawfully, which is untrue. Despite the contradictory perception of laboring in manual labor jobs, Latin Americans are also frequently portrayed as not being particularly motivated to work hard. In many parts of the world today, there are negative stereotypes about persons with inferior cognitive ability that target certain ethnic groups, including misconceptions about Americans of Latino heritage. In addition, Hispanic women are portrayed as a fertility threat. The idealized image of extant Latino family with many children as a result of the highly sexualized nature of the Latino is one of the factors contributing to the hypersexualization stereotype of Hispanic. Due to this, there is a political and social threat posed by Latina hyperfertility, where it is feared that their fictitious fertility and birth rate are far higher than those of non-Hispanic white people. This heightens the danger posed by the Latino present in the United States. A research in Orange County, California, which had a large concentration of Mexican American families, examined the sexual behavior of non-Hispanic white women with Latino. White women or non-Hispanic started having sex roughly a year earlier than all of the Latino in the poll report. Latino were more likely to report having had no more than 2 sexual partners than non-Hispanic white women, who were more likely to have had 5 or more partners. Latina and non-Hispanic white women both display a trend toward fewer kids per family. In actuality, it was discovered that second-generation Latino had fewer children than non-Hispanic white women. Furthermore, there are some of the most famous people in this ethnicity. The first one is Bill Richardson. He is a former governor of New Mexico, born on November 15, 1947. He ran for president of the United States in 2008 under the Democratic Party. He participated in a number of diplomatic initiatives, both while serving as the United States ambassador to the UN and later. He focuses on foreign policy problems while running for president. He also has previously held positions as a United States representative, ambassador to the UN, and Secretary of Energy for the United States. He presided over the Democrat successful retake of the majority of the nation's governorship as chairman of the 2004 Democratic National Convention and the Democratic Governor Association in 2005 and 2006. Richardson has received praise for securing the release of political prisoners, American service members, and hostages in Cuba, Iraq, and North Korea. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as the result of this effort. Next, we have Ellen Orchard. When she joined the 9-day mission aboard the Discovery Shuttle in 1993, Ellen Orchard made history as the first Hispanic American woman to travel into space. In the United States, from Mexico, Ellen Orchard's parents eventually settled in California, where Orchard was born in 1958. She first obtained a physics bachelor degree before obtaining an engineering master and doctorate from Stanford University. Orchard began working for NASA as a research engineer in 1988, and in 1990, she was chosen to become an astronaut. She went to space for the first time as a Hispanic woman 3 years later as part of a mission to examine the ozone layer on Earth. Orchard performed 3 more trips before being appointed as the first Hispanic director of the Johnson Space Center. Last, we have George Lopez. He was a comedian, actor, and talk show presenter. His comedic routine analyzed racial dynamics in the United States. Mexican-American birth in Mission Hill, Los Angeles in 1961. Lopez used his challenging upbringing as a springboard rather than a hydrant to his success. George was raised by his maternal grandmother and step-grandfather after being abandoned by his mother at the age of 10, and by his father when he was only 2 years old. And with college, George would discover how to use comedy to cope with his traumatic circumstances. George had dominated the comedy club by the late 1980s, touring the nation and making appearances on TV shows and comedy specials. And in the 1990s, he made his debut in the comedy Ski Patrol, which was followed by Photo Instinct. This acting role plus his success in the realm of standing-up comedy helped him get ready to write and star in the ABC sitcom John Lopez, which ran from 2002 to 2007. Josh's achievement made him one of the few Latino actors in television comedy shows. As of right now, Josh still performs stand-up comedy across the nation and also starred in creating the single-camera sitcom Lopez on TV Land, where he played fictitious version of himself. The Lopez Foundation was started by Josh Lopez. It aids in offering important local and artistic resources of schooling. Additionally, George and Anne served as the National Kidney Foundation's spokespeople for a significant amount of time. Lopez enjoyed investing a lot of time in a neighborhood, in recognition of his enormous fundraising effort in supporting of earthquake victims in El Salvador and Guatemala. He was given the Manny Motor Foundation Community Spirit Award and given the title of Honorary Mayor of Los Angeles. Finally, moving on to the last part of our presentation, when has Mexican been portrayed in the popular media? Eris and Hal Muller reported that news media coverage concentrated primarily on stereotypes and misjudgment when it addressed the community, rather than on the positive characteristics associated with Hispanic. Since illegal immigration has become associated with the Hispanic, news media programs have contributed to this development.